Hello lovelies! Today I have for you an awesome vegan kale and spinach artichoke dip recipe. This is one that I modified from the Minimalist Baker and just tweaked a little bit. I'll link that recipe below for you, but let's go ahead and get started. First, I started with about 3/4 of a cup of cashews. I didn't have raw cashews as described in the recipe, so I actually just used roasted cashews, but they're unsalted. So you're going to steep those in some boiling water for about an hour. Next, what I did was get about 4 cloves of garlic. One of them was really large, so I just did 4. I peeled those, I chopped them up, and you're going to saute those. It doesn't need to be perfect because these are actually going to be blended into the sauce. You can see I'm using here my Shun chef's knife, which is just my favorite thing I have in my kitchen. I can't say enough good things about Shun. I'll link the website for Shun below as well in case you're interested in getting some of their knives. I had some leftover kale that was starting to turn yellow in my fridge, so I decided to use that for this recipe. It was a great way to use up the kale that I had left over rather than just making kale chips or a kale salad, especially since they were yellowing. I stripped the kale from the stalks. I'm not a big fan of kale stalks, and then just roughly chopped them before going ahead and using my salad spinner and giving them a good wash and rinse and dry. If you're going to cook with a chef's knife, which I highly recommend, you have far more stability. I pretty much use my chef's knife for everything that I do. You want to make sure you know how to hold a knife properly, so I will link a video below that also is a great one that I watched when I was learning how to hold a knife properly so that I could have the most amount of stability and really reduce the risk of making an error and cutting myself. I also had some frozen spinach that I wanted to use up, so I decided to add that into this recipe. It's not part of the original recipe, but I think it worked out really, really well. I thawed it out in the sink, and after doing that, I sauteed the garlic in a little bit of olive oil just until they started to get a little bit brown. Next, I prepped the beans and the artichoke hearts. So this dip is a little interesting because it has white beans in it. I chose Great Northern beans, and then for the artichoke hearts, I just got whole artichoke hearts from Whole Foods, so I needed to actually quarter those. I carefully removed the artichoke hearts from the can. I tried to squeeze as much of the liquid very gently out of the hearts before going ahead and using my chef's knife to quarter those artichoke hearts one at a time carefully. They are really tender, so it's easy to kind of smush them or break them while you're doing this part, but don't worry too much about it. Once you get stirring everything around into the dip, they're going to come apart a little bit anyways. Now that my cashews are soaked, I could turn on the oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. I poured in all of the soaked cashews into my blender, as well as the garlic. We use a Breville blender that is just a powerhouse. It's awesome. I also used this Tofutti vegan cream cheese. I hadn't used it before. I used the entire container. Also added in 2 tablespoons of olive oil. And then I added a 1/2 cup of unsweetened almond milk. I I then added in, about halfway through the blending, about 4 tablespoons of nutritional yeast. I wanted to start sort of on the lower end and then add more in if I thought that it needed it. For this batch, the 4 tablespoons was perfect. I also added just a couple of pinches of salt and a little bit of pepper as well. This is what it looked like after a good solid blending. It was a really nice creamy consistency. So I just poured that out into a bowl, making sure to get as much of it as possible out of my blender. It made quite a lot of this cream. I sauteed my kale and spinach for a while until most of the moisture was out and everything was bright green. And once that was done, I went ahead and added in my quartered artichoke hearts and my entire can of white beans that I drained, and just mixed those up. You can see that it's sort of steaming because I added the cold ingredients to the hot pan, which is fine. After giving that a good stir, I added in my creamy sauce. And I just used my spoon to mix that around for probably a couple of minutes just to make sure everything was really well mixed before going ahead and finishing this recipe in the oven. And this is how it turned out of the oven. It was just delicious. It was even better the next day reheated, so totally something you can make ahead. And my brother Carl, who is a complete meat eater, totally approved of this dish. Enjoy!